Welcome back to Connection Point Studies. We're glad to have you along. We've been in this series for 4 weeks now. This is our 5th study. Great studies. They're a little bit deep, and hopefully people have been able to rise above all that and keep their head above water in this study. And we're going to cover a lot of Scripture today.
Right.
So we really need to get into it. You've got a quote to warm us up to get us going.
Yeah. This is from Dr. Timothy Francis Leary. Remember him from the 60s?
No, I don't.
Experimented with LSD. He was the guy that said, tune in, turn off, and drop out.
Oh, okay, I remember that quote. Okay.
Yeah, really brilliant guy. Yeah. Anyway, he said, if you want to change the way people respond to you, change the way you respond to people.
That's actually
pretty good.
Pretty good, isn't it? Yeah, pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about our mind, the way we think, and we're talking about changing our mind and all of that. And so, has anyone ever changed your mind? How did they do it? And then, what's even better, have you ever changed anyone's mind? I mean, you might consider being honest about your spouse that you're sitting next to, or your boyfriend or girlfriend. Have you ever had a chance to change their mind? Is that even possible? And how did it work? And have a fun with that discussion question. And we want them to read a little bit before they come back.
Yeah, we want you to take a look at Romans 8, 1 through 17. And there's an interesting thought. This passage, some translations start with therefore. And I always say, what is that word therefore?
Yeah.
So what is he connecting this thought to? Right. And he says now, and I want to know what now? What time is he referring to?
Good. We'll come back and talk about it. Okay, what's it there for? It seems like it's connected to his struggle. Last week we talked about his personal struggle, right? Isn't it kind of connected to that whole question of how do we overcome this problem?
Yeah, remember last week we said the law is good, but I have this indwelling power of sin, this problem. And we concluded with the answer is Jesus, but we didn't get a lot of detail.
Yeah.
And so he goes on to say, now something's happened. And he says, there's no condemnation for those who belong to Christ.
Yeah.
That's
a pretty powerful statement. I love that. I love this verse. I love this chapter 8. It's so good.
Yeah, the now is important because the now points back to the death and resurrection of Christ, which was accomplished, 2,000 years ago. That was the now that enabled this to be possible. The no condemnation.
Which the way I look at that, I think of, I've had so many people, that are this kind of a people, and to think that God looks at us in a very different way. He no longer condemns us, or our life no longer condemns us because of this power in our life. Now, we want to actually go into depth on each of the Scripture, and you've got some questions to help us do that. So let's start with the first question.
So Paul goes into this little discussion about the law again. Again, he's talking to people who love the law and they don't like what he's been saying about the law, and so he has to explain it a little bit. So in verse 3, why couldn't the law save us?
Right. Good question. Again, with his questions, he's really kind of debating through this whole passage, and then he asks a question and goes on. So why couldn't the law save us? Yeah, so
he says, some translations say because of it was weakened by the flesh, which is just his way of saying, remember in Romans 7, he talked about this power in the body, and some translations say flesh. It's just a way of saying your physical body, this power manifests itself. And remember, the law is just a set of rules. It gives you no power. It just says what you're doing is wrong. So it can only point out, remember we said it draws a line.
Yeah.
But it can only point out the line, but it can't help you.
It doesn't have the power to change us. So that's why it doesn't work. So then the question we want you to think about next is, what did God do and how did that help? And you can find this in verses 8:3 and 8:4. Take a little bit of time and answer that question. Okay, this is an interesting passage. This kind of details out, and we probably all kind of know this. Maybe there's some that don't know this, but let's just kind of go through the basics again in this passage. What is it about what God did that we know?
What's great about this passage, it says, what the law could not do, God did.
Yeah.
I love that because the law just makes you feel terrible. It makes you feel guilty, and it can't save you, but God did it. And so this is pure gospel right here. He said God did it by sending his son.
Yeah. A person, not a law, not a
law,
book,
right.
not a,
Yeah, and he says, in the likeness of sinful flesh. So he was in a body, but it wasn't a body with the sin problem like ours.
Yeah.
Right? And that he bore our sin and the condemnation that came with it. So all of the condemnation that I deserved, that you deserved, that everybody deserved, was laid on Christ. So he bore our punishment.
Yeah.
Remember, the law says the soul that sins will die.
Yeah.
I deserve to die. You deserve to die. Christ died for us. And so that's what set us free. That's when God did it. And this doesn't mean that we're now perfect, but it just means that the penalty was paid for us.
Well, I look at this, I think any time that we've allowed sin to control our life, it kills us.
Yeah.
In so many aspects, it just kills us. And this is saying it doesn't have to kill you anymore. This is taking away the power of that sin to kill you in your life. So we want you to go a little bit deeper, and let's look at the next question here.
Yeah, so the next question, Paul moves into talking about the way you think, or a mindset. And he says that it reveals some things about your relationship to God. So you can find this in verses 5 through 8, and also Galatians 5:17.
Okay, take a little bit of time and look at that. Okay, we kind of have two mindsets here, and again, your notes, you've done a good job, and if your leader wants to share these notes, are in a box there to kind of show the two mindsets. Maybe you picked them up, maybe you didn't, but just go through the two mindsets here.
Yeah, so there's a mindset of the flesh, okay, which is again, the flesh is just Paul's way of saying the body, and so the mind's kind of set on whatever the body wants.
Yeah.
It's the sort of person who's like,
I'm hungry.
I want to do this, I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
That sort of mindset thinks about the things of the flesh, whatever the body wants. It results in death. It's hostile to God. It's rebellious, unable to please God. Then there's a mindset of the Spirit, which thinks about the things of the Spirit, things that the Spirit wants, and it results in life and peace.
And so all of those are gone through and contrasted, one after the other, in the box that you put together here.
Yeah.
And hopefully you get a chance to think about those together. Now, we want you to focus next on what does Paul say about the body in chapter 8, verses 9 through 11. And is there any hope? Is there any hope for this problem that we have?
Yeah, see, Paul's been kind of hard on the body.
Yeah,
he was hard on the law, and he's hard on the body. He's like, you got this indwelling sin thing, your body just wants to do stuff, and
can we control our desires, in other words?
Yeah. And so he says, your body is dead in the sense that it's separated from God because of this indwelling sin. It has this conflict that's going on between the flesh and the spirit. But one day, God says, he's going to solve the body problem by bringing our mortal bodies to life through a resurrection. And there's a number of scriptures we've listed there in the New Testament that says one day God's going to solve this body problem.
So, so as we look at the last question, and we focus at the last question, what does Paul say about your obligation or your I guess that's the question, and it's specifically 8:12 through 17.
Yeah.
Take a little bit of time and think about your obligation and answer that question.
So obligation, kind of means like here's something you owe it. You owe it to yourself. So he says it in a negative way. He says we have no obligation to the flesh, right?
Right.
We don't have to do what it wants to do. That's not our obligation. Instead, we have an obligation to God, right? To do what he's called us to do. And then he goes in this little discussion of, we're sons of God, if we're led by the Spirit of God. And then he says we're children, we're like adopted into his family. There's one very subtle difference between the words that's translated sons and children. The word sons is a term that means someone who has some responsibility. It's a child that's old enough to have a responsibility.
12, at least 12, right?
Yeah. So he's saying, like, you're not just here as like little babies.
Yeah.
You have an obligation.
Yeah.
You have a responsibility.
That's good. So he's saying take some ownership of your life. And really that's a pretty good to-do, isn't it, in our life right now? When we look at that, is that we have to take some ownership to the part of the things that we need to do in our life. So maybe in your thinking here today, maybe you want to share a little bit of your own personal struggles or what God's doing in your life. This is really a chance for you guys as a group to kind of wrap up the study and talk about what we've been talking about and your spiritual journey. Pray for each other, encourage each other, and we'll see you next week at Connection Point Studies.